Let me just pin my video. All right, today we are going to move on to chapter 7. And chapter 7, so in chapter 6, we looked at we had this overhead, right? And this overhead would be things like HR, finance, right? Housekeeping, all the other kind of cost centers, right? Cost. Okay. Right, cost centers. And we looked at pushing that money down, right, these costs down to our profit centers. So we might have, you know, let's say ENT, right, ears, nose, and throat, and say family practice, right, or family medicine. They don't like to be called family practice. And then, so that was kind of chapter 6. Was, you know, we want to push these costs because these costs are meaningless by themselves, right? They have to be assigned ultimately because we're trying to get at profitability, and since cost centers don't make any money, we're trying to get at we have to assign all those costs down to the profit centers. The profit centers have direct costs, right? And then we're going to assign them that overhead, right? So HR hanging out by itself doesn't mean anything. HR is providing services, right, to each of these sections. So we have to assign some of HR to each of these sections. Okay, so we've got that. And then we have to, now we look down here and we say, well, maybe, you know, ENT maybe has, so this was common, like I said, I think I've told you this, in military organizations, we very often had in ENT, we'd have one space, and that one space we'd have maybe audiology as well as otolaryngology, the actual ENT docs, right? And so ENT might then have audiology, right, and the actual, you know, ENT otolaryngologist. But we might have, you know, within ENT, we might have 2 services. So we have kind of the organizational overhead, right, of HR and finance and whatnot. That's got to get down to ENT, and then that's got to be shared out ultimately to the cost center, excuse me, to the profit centers within ENT. But then ENT might also have, you know, this is going to be kind of messy, but like a, you know, PSRs, right? So they have and they might have a waiting room, and these are shared, right? Shared between, so at the ENT level, they have some shared expenses. They have some PSRs, so patient service reps. That's something you might wind up doing when you graduate. If you decide you want to go into operations, that's a, you know, one of those, I got to pay my dues so that I can someday be a COO kind of roles. So you know, you have a waiting room, right? You might have shared nursing staff. So here's the thing. At the ENT level, these would be direct costs to the ENT department. These shared costs that are shared between audiology and otolaryngology. So if we're looking at ENT as a unit, these would be direct costs to ENT. They'd be budgeted for the department. So if ENT is a department, we would budget the cost of the PSRs, waiting room is kind of overheadish kind of thing, but space, shared, you know, any nursing staff they had, Maybe supplies, maybe they share same supplies. So they all use, I think otoscope is the one they look in the ear. I forget. This is the one you look in the eyes, and the other one you look in the ears. I think otoscope is ears. So they're like otoscopes. So they both would use otoscopes potentially, right? So they would be sharing some, the little black coverings that they put on top of the scope before they shove it in your ear, so that you don't get somebody else's earwax shoved in your ear, right? So they might have some shared supplies that are purchased at the department level. But now we actually have two services. So maybe this is our department, and these are our services. So we go down to the service level. So we have the organization level, we have the department level, and then we have the service level. So we're kind of going down a hierarchy, right? So at the department level, we would hire PSRs to work in ENT, right? In this ENT department, where they have there's a waiting room, and the waiting room is there for both audiology and otolaryngology. And so the same PSR checks in people to go to otolaryngology as well as to audiology. There might be a nurse that goes back and forth between the two services without any really, just whoever needs him or her. They might have some supplies that they're sharing. So certainly they would be sharing office supplies like paper and pencils and stuff. But they might also be sharing some medical supplies and medical equipment that just kind of get ordered at the department level, and then it's just simpler to just be like, just grab it when you need it, rather than trying to be like, oh no, this is the audiology's share of the copy paper, and this is the otolaryngology share of the copy paper. That's too much work. We're just going to lump it all in one spot, and so buy it at the department level, and then we have to figure out. But here's the thing. We have to figure out how to share these expenses to audiology, to the respective services. So my point here is, at the department level, these are direct expenses. But at the service level, it's overhead. Does that make sense? Right? So it depends on the level of organization you're looking at as to whether it's a direct expense or overhead. And so if you're looking at it at the ENT level, right, these are direct expenses because these PSRs only work in ENT. They don't work in family medicine, right? So it's a direct expense to an ENT department, right? The waiting room expenses are a direct expense to ENT. The nursing staff that works in ENT is a direct expense to ENT. They never work in family medicine. If you ask them, where do you work? I work in ENT. Okay, do you work in audiology or otolaryngology? Yes. Okay, I work in both. I go back and forth between them as they need me. But at the department level, it's a direct expense to ENT because none of these things ever go to family medicine, right? They're employed by and purchased by the ENT department. But now we're going down, we're getting inside the black box. You'll hear that phrase, like, what goes on inside the black box? That's a metaphor that's often used for like unexplained processes. And so we're breaking open the black box of ENT and saying, all right, what's happening inside of ENT? Well, inside of ENT, we've got these assets that are purchased by ENT, but they're actually shared at another level. So really, we're just kind of continuing the same process we learned in chapter 6. Okay? We're just taking it, what the purpose of this chapter is to kind of get you to think exactly what I'm talking about here. And it depends on what level you're looking at as to whether something's overhead or a direct cost. Okay? So ultimately, all of the costs have to get down to where the rubber meets the road, right? Where there's actually patient care being delivered, because that's how we make our money. So all of these costs ultimately have to be pushed down to the service level. And sometimes there's no difference between a department and a service, and sometimes there is. Right? Family medicine as a department, let's say. So imagine we had a large practice. You might have like a large specialty practice. So I'm thinking of Maine Medical Partners. is a 500 physician, 500 plus physician medical specialty group up out of Portland, but it has units all over southern Maine. They have a primary care division and a specialty care division. Right? They break out that way, right? And then they get into further, break down further and further. So you kind of have the same kind of hierarchy effect. And so expenses, and I'm not 100% sure about their structure, but their cost structure, but probably it rolls up to, how much did primary care cost? How much revenue did primary care bring in, right? But then below primary care would be, well, we have the clinic in Biddeford, and we have the clinic in, now I can't think of any Maine towns, but Kittery, and we have the, and so forth, right? And so you'd have primary care, and then you'd break out into, the different clinics with different locations. And so you'd have to allocate, so some expenses would be clear and obvious, like if you're a PSR in Biddeford, you're probably not working at, the Portland location also. So then you'd be direct cost to that clinic, right? But you might roll up to say primary care if this was, so there's different ways of thinking about organizational hierarchy and how things get shared out. And so depending on what level you're at, something might be a direct cost, right? Or it might appear to be an overhead. So this let's say that the ENT department has 3 PSRs, right, that work their front desk. Well, none of the 3 are directly assigned to either audiology or otolaryngology. So how do we share those out? So that's the point of this. So we're going to look at a couple of standard methods for sharing out that cost. 2 of them are very similar to what we have already done. And then the third one just adds a little layer of complexity. So the first version we're going to do is cost to charges ratio, VCR. We'll do the relative value unit method, or ratio, so we'll call it RVU, right? And these are very similar to what we did in chapter 6. And then we'll do a little bit about activity-based accounting, or costing rather. Activity-based costing, ABC, which is more complicated, but still kind of comes back to the same general concept. So those are the 3 things we're going to do. All of these involve that same 4-step method that we've been talking about in some way, shape, or form, right? You find the pool, right? The driver, the allocation rate, and the allocation amount. Right? Still, but it's going to look maybe a little bit different depending on how we do, which one of these we're doing. The first 2 look very similar. The third one, like I said, adds an additional layer of complexity. So let's say we have that arrangement that we were just talking about, where we have a department of ENT that has 2 clinics in it, audiology and ENT. So we have this department of ENT, right? And it has 2 clinics. So we'll have audiology and ENT. Right? And they have an annual volume visits of, say, an equal amount. They both have 5,000 visits. And this is out of your book, and these RVUs are totally whack. I really should change it, but let's say RVUs per visit is 10 versus 18. So we have a total over here, right? So 5,000 plus 5,000 is 10. There are 10,000 visits. We have an RVU per visit. And then we have costs. We have costs. We have direct costs. and overhead costs. And this is at the department level. So cost direct, we have 242,500 and in my glasses. And 485,000 for a total of 727,500. Overhead that's being pushed down to the either overhead like HR, housekeeping, finance that's being pushed down from the organization to the department, or is a direct cost to the department, right, but has to be pushed down to the respective services, right? So all of that at the service level is overhead, right? So to the service, if you're a service line manager, if you're the practice manager for, overseeing, if there was such a thing, a separate practice manager for audiology, you don't really care whether it's HR coming down from the organization, or it's the PSR expenses that are direct costs at the department level. Either way, to you in audiology, it's overhead. And let's say that that is going to be 300,000. So at the total level, we've got 1,027,500 in expenses. Then we have charges. Let's call that annual charges. Audiology charges 700,000, and ENT charges 1.4 million, for a total of 2,100,000 in total charges. So charges going to be your charge master rates, right? This is the funny money that we put out, that we say that goes on our charge master that says this is how much we bill. And remember, why do I call that funny money? Because those numbers that we put out there are just really starting points for negotiation with the insurance companies that are going to pay us. So if you want to, so we don't actually expect to collect this amount of money. This is just the billed amount, right? The actual revenues, right? This is our gross, right? From the what we talked about in chapter 3, gross patient service revenue. Our net patient service revenue is 400,000 and 900,000 for a total of 1.3 million. So they bill out 700, but they actually collect 400. They bill out 1.4 million, but they actually collect 900,000. So that's the information we have. I'm using this is an example from the book, and I'm using the 10 RVUs and 18 RVUs. That just doesn't happen. Not on outpatient visits, and audiology doesn't do inpatient. So these numbers, I'm just being consistent with the book, but really it'd probably be more like 1 and 1.8. But I want to be consistent with the way this book, the example from your book does. Okay, so now the question is, we want to know what's the total cost of providing an audiology visit, because we want to know what's the minimum we would have to charge to cover our costs, right? So how do we figure that out? Well, we've got the direct cost for audiology. It's 242,000. We've got the direct cost for ENT, 485,000. And then at the let me call that Odo, just to distinguish it from the department. So, so we have the Department of ENT, and then we have otolaryngology. I'll just do that. So the Department of ENT has this $300,000 of overhead. It's a mixture of overhead coming down from the organization, like the organization's HR, the organization's the cost of the parking, of maintaining the parking lot, you know, so we're gonna, that gets all pushed down to the departments, to the profit centers, right? As well as, so in that 300,000 is the organizational overhead, and then from the perspective of the services, it is it also includes the departmental overhead, the shared nursing staff, the shared technician staff, right? The shared supplies, the shared space, all that gets rolled into that overhead. So this overhead is a combination of organizational level overhead as well as departmental level overhead that's being pushed down to the services. Okay. So now we've got to figure out, all right, we've got that 300,000. How do we push that down? Well, we've got to think this through. So the first version we're going to do, or the first thing we've got to say is, all right, that 300,000. Step one, cost pool, 300,000. All right, so that's our 300,000. Now we want to say, all right, what are we going to use as a driver? Well, the first variation on this that we could do as a driver is the cost to charges ratio. So that means we're going to use charges as our driver. So we're going to look down here and say, okay, we've got 300,000 at the department ENT level. We want to push that down to audiology and otolaryngology. So we're going to use charges. When we come up with the cost driver CD, right? When we come up with the cost driver, right, we're going to use the total for the organization. So in this case, the organization, right, is the ENT department. That's the 2.1 million. Right? A lot of people get confused and they pick one of these two instead of using the total, or they'll add up the whole row, which duplicates, right? Because 2.1 is the sum of 701.4. Yeah. So the cost driver is going to be the annual charges, as opposed to the overhead. The overhead is the pool, and the cost driver we're going to use this time is charges. Okay. So cost driver 2 million, cost driver 2.1 million. So we're going to now, as we did before, divide the cost pool by the cost driver to give you the allocation rate. So 300 divided by 2.1 million is about 0.143 dollars of overhead per dollar of charges. So we want to allocate overhead to audiology. So now we go back and we say, okay, audiology. So for allocation amount, right, we have audiology and we have ENT, Odo, right? So they each get 0.143 dollars of overhead per dollar of charges, right? And then 0.143 overhead per dollar charges, right, times the amount of charges. So ENT has 700, Odo has 1.4 million, so we have 700 and 1.4 million. So 0.143 times 700 gives us approximately 100,000, and 0.143 times 1.4 million gives us approximately 200,000. Right? If we add those two together, we get the 300,000. So this is very much like doing the direct method. So we would then go back and say, okay, audiology total cost is equal to the direct cost, 242,500, plus their share of the overhead, 100,000, gives us 342,500. Total cost for Odo is 485,000 plus their share of overhead, which is 200,000. So that gives us 685,000. Right? So we've now allocated, and if we add that up, we're going to get our 1,027,500. So we've allocated. Now we come up with, now we say, oh, how much is that per visit? Well, they each had 5,000 visits, so we divide the totals. So cost per visit for audio is 342,500 divided by 5,000 gives us 6,850 per visit. And for Odo, it's 685,000 divided by 5,000 visits gives us 137. Okay, so now we know using the cost to charge ratio, right? So we took the costs, the overhead 300,000, and we allocated it using charges. So that's our cost to charge ratio. So our cost pool was 300,000. Our cost driver was charges, 2.1 million, and we used the total amount. So if I ask you in a problem, use cost to charge ratio to tell me how much cost is going to be allocated to audiology, you're not going to use the audiology charges as the denominator. You're going to use the overall as the denominator, because when we do the allocation rate, we determine the allocation rate based on the overall the allocation of, in this case, the department, right? So we want the department total in the denominator. We're not going to use 700,000. We're going to use 2.1 million. This is a place that a lot of folks make a mistake. So we allocate, we come up with our allocation rate of dollars of overhead per dollars of charges, and we allocate that way. So that's one way to do it. And you get, the answer you get is 6,850 and 137. And so you'd know, in this case, in order to cover costs, we would have to charge 6,850 or 137. So it's very much like we did before. It's just the logic is the same. It's like direct allocation. Okay? The difference between what we did in the prior chapter is really where we are in the organization, right? Are we at the department level, or now we're down at the service level? So now we're down at the service level. All right, so that's cost to charges. Good. The cost to charges is one way to do it. But if I told you, and kind of going with cost to charge, well, yeah, we got time. Going with cost to charges, charges are, let's extend this a little bit. So you know charges are funny money, right? We know that because the charges are never what we actually collect. Those charges are just, we just put that out there as a starting point for negotiations with our insurance companies. So I probably said this before, but it's kind of like you're going to, you go over to, Dover Honda and you walk around the lot and you go up to your, if you're like me and you're like, I really want a new minivan because the minivan I drive is 16 years old and it's time to replace it. So I get all excited. I go to the lot and I go up to the to this really cool looking minivan, new minivan, right? And I look at the sticker price, and the sticker price is, MSRP, manufacturer suggested retail price of $42,000. Well, what I know is that's just the starting point for negotiations. They don't actually expect me to pay $42,000. I mean, they'd like me to pay $42,000, right? They'd be more than happy for me to pay $42,000, but they don't actually expect me to pay $42,000, right? There's actually they know how much they actually paid for it, right? They probably paid more like $32,000 for it. And so there's a $10,000 window of negotiations. Well, with our example, right, they billed out $700,000, but they negotiated down to $400,000 in revenues. And so if we divide 400,000 by 5,000, we get, what is that? 8, right? So $80 per visit. So they're bringing in $80 per visit in revenues. They asked for, I can't do 70. Is, well, what's 70 divided by 5? Should do that. They asked for $140 per visit. What they actually get is 80, right? So at 700,000, they're asking for 140,000 per visit. Excuse me, $140 per visit. What they actually collect is on average $80 per visit. So kind of the starting point is we'd like you to pay 140. Insurance companies, we'd like you to pay $140 per visit. The insurance company says, nah, I'm not going to do that. And by the way, I know that's like the sticker at the Honda dealership. I don't intend to pay it, and you don't actually expect me to pay it. So let's talk about what you actually want me to pay. And so as it turns out, what we're willing to take is actually $80 per visit. And since we know that our cost is $68.50, we're okay with that because we're making a profit of what, $11.50 per visit. So when I think about the ChargeMaster numbers, that's what the reference point that I use is. It's like shopping for a new car, right? Or even a used car. Like you walk down, if you go to used cars, they always have the big numbers written on the windshield, right? So that's not the number you're going to pay either, right? It's always a starting point for negotiation. So all that said, since we know this is funny money, we could, instead of using charges, we could use revenues, right? We could use the actual revenues coming in to allocate overhead. So that would be a variation on the cost of charges. Instead of using charges, we're using actual revenues. Right? So how would that look? Well, how would that look? What would I do? 4-step method. We use revenues instead of charges. So first step is cost pool. And cost pool is still 300. So what am I going to use for my cost driver? Well, I said, I want to use revenues instead of charges. So what's the number I'm going to use for my cost driver? I'm going to use 1.3 million. Good. Right, because I'm not going to use either this or this. I'm going to use the total amount for the in this case department, right? So then I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to divide 300,000 by 1.3 million, right? And that gives me an allocation rate of approximately $0.2308 in overhead per dollar of revenue. So now I do my allocation instead. And my allocation amount for audiology and for Odo, right, is going to be 0.2308 times, so 0.2308 times what for audiology? Anybody on Zoom? What am I going to multiply that 0.2308 by? So I'm trying to figure out how much I'm going to allocate to the audiology service using revenues. So I've calculated my cost pool was the 300,000. That didn't change. I'm just looking for different ways to allocate 300,000. Right? I said, okay, well, my cost driver is going to be total revenues. So I divided 300 by 1.3 million. And I came up with an allocation rate of 0.2308 dollars of overhead per dollar of revenue. So now I'm going back to audiology and I'm saying, okay, audiology 0.2308 times what?
Would it be 400,000?
It would be the 400,000, right? Because I'm using, so if I'm using annual revenues as my driver, initially I calculate the allocation rate by using the total of whatever the driver is. But then when I'm going to go to the unit now, so I'm going from the ENT department down to audiology, I don't use the total revenues. I now go to use the revenues just for audiology. This is the way we did it in chapter 6 as well, right? We had, initially we would find the organization level driver, and then we would go to the individual departments, or in chapter 6 it was departments, now it's going to be services, and the driver for the particular service. Okay, so we're going to use for audiology 400,000, and for Odo it's 0.2308 times 900,000, and so we get 92,308 and 207,692, which adds up to 300,000. So we know we did it right. Right? And so we can say, okay, using revenues instead, total cost for audiology is going to be its direct costs of, see that? Okay. 242,500 plus its overhead costs of 92,308 is going to give us 334,808, and total cost for Odo is going to be 485. The direct costs, 485,000, plus its share, 207,692, gives us a total of 692,692. So then we can say, all right, what's the Cost per visit for audiology, right? Dollar per visit for audio is going to be 334,808 divided by 5,000, and dollars per visit for oto is going to be 692 divided by 5,000. So that gives us 66.96 and 138.54. And so you can already know, if you're looking back at your notes, before we had 100,000 overhead going to audiology and 200 going to otolaryngology. This time we have 92,000 going to audiology and 207 going to otolaryngology. The results being, under cost to charges, we had 68.50 cost of 68.50 for otolaryngology. Under cost to revenue, we have 66.96. For otolaryngology, under cost to charges, it's 137, but under cost to revenue, it's 138. So we've used the same technique, right? But we used a different driver. So the question is, right? The question is for these techniques is, which one is really which one is more fair, right? So if you had a revenue or a profit sharing arrangement where the doctors or the providers in each department get a bonus based on how much profit their department makes or their service makes, your providers are going to care about your choice, right? Because if you use cost to revenue, it makes audiology more expensive. Sorry, I said, if you use cost to charges, it makes audiology relatively more expensive than if you use cost to revenues, right? And it makes, and cost to charges makes, as a result, the inverse, makes cost to charges makes otolaryngology less expensive and cost to revenue more expensive. So if you've got, providers on audiology side, they're going to say, we think that, cost to revenue would be more fair. And the providers on the otolaryngology side would say, well, we think cost to charges is more fair. And you've got to come up with a rationale as to which one is more fair, right? But the goal is to have something that's a methodology that is more accurate, because by doing profit sharing, you want to motivate your providers to work harder, right? To work harder, to generate more effort, to exercise that discretionary effort that we were talking about before class, right? So which one would be more accurate? Well, what's your gut say? Which one would you use? Feel free to chime in too. What's your gut say? So Ali says, would it be revenue? Because that's the amount you're actually getting. And I would tend to agree, right? The revenue one has some basis in reality, and charges is just like this made up thing that somebody in the CFO's office did, right? They just wrote some stuff down. And so revenues, at least, is the result of a negotiation with your payers, whereas cost of charges is just, Taylor sitting in her cubicle just decided to, sounds good. Let me put down, 140. That sounds good. I like 140. It sounds like a nice number. We'll put it out there. So to me, right, charges, because charges is, is typically funny money. I would say let's get something that has some basis in reality rather than something that Taylor made up, because she was hurrying to get to lunch. Right. So that's kind of two variations on the same idea, right? And they're both pretty straightforward and simple. And of course, we've got to make it more complicated. So, and so RVUs is the next. So cost to RVUs. So cost to charges, cost to revenues. The book doesn't have cost to revenues, but I demonstrate it just because it's the same process. It was just picking a different driver. RVU ratio is the same, essentially the same process, except we've got one more step. So if we're going to use RVUs as our cost driver, so we're going to go back here. So under the RVU method, we're going to use RVUs as the cost driver. So step one is the cost pool. And the cost pool hasn't changed, right? We're still looking at allocating that 300,000. So the cost pool is the same, right? 300,000. The cost driver is going to be RVUs in this case, right? So we need to know, and so we want, and so you know you have 10 RVUs per visit for audiology. Again, totally unrealistic. We probably just put it, you know, except all my numbers are done with you know, let's just do that. Let's just put a decimal point there, because then it'll make me feel better. Now stop saying that, not really like that. So let's call it 1.0. How about that? So, all your notes off now. Right? But we'll just call it 1 and 1.8, because that'll make me feel better. And it won't make much difference in the math. So we know that we get 1 RVU per visit for audiology, and we get 1.8 RVUs for otolaryngology. What does that tell you, first of all, based on your knowledge of RVUs? What does that tell you about the nature of the visits that are happening in each of the services? At least, what should it tell you? Yeah, Caitlin. Yeah. Okay, so Caitlin said what RVU should tell you, an RVU of 1.8 versus an RVU of 1.0, what it should tell you is there's more effort happening. An otolaryngology physician is probably spending more time and more effort with a patient than the audiologist is. That's ideally how you should be interpreting what an RVU is. It is a measure of, right, it was 3 parts. If you remember going back to our discussion in chapter 2. It was the work RVU, which is the actual effort of the provider, the practice expense RVU, which is the amount of cost incurred to support the type of service done. So that would imply like there's additional equipment or something like that, right? And then the malpractice expense, which is the risk, right? The risk of being sued, that gets incorporated there. So it would make sense. Well, so first of all, otolaryngology is a surgical service. Audiology doesn't actually do anything to you, right? They just test you. So, you know, there's a lot more risk involved if you're going to cut somebody open than if you're just going to put some headphones on them and torture them in the little, you know, by playing super soft sounds that they think they can hear, can't hear, right? So malpractice expense obviously would be higher, right? As it, you know, we could make an argument about practice expense as to, you know, how much more expensive is the equipment for each of the services. You know, and then the actual work, the amount of time. Well, the audiologist actually spends a fair amount of time with you when you do a hearing test. It's a very lengthy thing. But they do some other things, like they don't just do hearing tests. I mean, I keep coming back to that because I'm like scarred by doing hearing tests. But they also do stuff like fit you for hearing aids. Like if you get, you know, once you get tested, then they put the right kind of hearing aid on you. So if you have family members maybe who have hearing aids, you know, an audiologist typically does that. So that's part of their practice. Okay, but the kind of the overarching, Caitlin is right on. The overarching interpretation should be the visits are more intense in the otolaryngology service than they are in the audiology service. That's kind of the intent of the RVU concept. So if we're going to use RVUs per visit, right, or excuse me, if we're going to use RVUs as our cost driver, what do we need to know? total RVUs, right? So let me jot down here a new line, total RVUs, right? And so how many RVUs does audiology generate in this year? It's not a trick. 5,000, right? Okay, 5,000. 5,000 times 1, right? 5,000 visits times 1 RVU per visit gives me 5,000 RVUs. 5,000 times 1.8, I can't do in my head. I have it written down somewhere. Gives me 9,000 RVUs. So then the total RVUs for the Department of ENT is 5,000 plus 9,000 is 14,000 RVUs. Okay, so now we have our cost. So what is going to be our cost driver? So we said it's RVUs, so what number are we going to use to calculate our allocation rate? The 14,000, right? We're going to use the overall department's total of 14,000 RVUs. So now we get the allocation rate. So within the Department of ENT, the allocation rate is going to be 300,000 divided by 14,000. Is going to be 2140. Yeah, we'll go with 2143. You know, roughly 2143 overhead per RVU. Okay. So now we want the allocation amount for audiology and the allocation amount we want for oto. So it's going to be 2143 and 2143, right? $21.43 per RVU. So we multiply. So for audiology, I'm going to multiply 2143 times 5,000. Good, Aaron. And for otolaryngology, I'm going to be 2143 times 9,000. So 2143 times 5,000 is 107,142, and 21. Well, let me do it. Make it exact. 300 divided by 14 times 9,000. That's all right. Is 192,857. That dot should be there. So we add those two together, we might be off by a few cents, but that's going to add up to 300. Right. Okay, so now we can say, all right, we want the total cost for audiology and total cost for oto, right? We go back, same as we've been doing. The direct cost for audiology is 242,500. The allocation is 107,142. Right, so we wind up with a total of $349,643, and direct cost for oto is 485,000 plus its allocation of 192,857, right? So that adds up to 677, 857. And then we can take and divide through, and we say, all right, so now we've got 347, right? 349, sorry, 349. So we care about cost per visit because that's how we charge our patients, is on a visit per visit basis. And we want to be able to compare. So dollars per visit for audiology is going to be $349, $643 divided by 5,000 is going to give us $69.93. Dollars per visit for Odo is going to give us $677, $857 divided by 5,000 is going to give us $135.57. All right. So this is on using the RVU method. So now we can compare. When we used charges, we came up with, for audiology, we came up with 68. When we used revenue, we came up with 66. And when we use RVUs, we come up with 69. When we do, for Odo, it's 137, 138, and 135. So there's, there's a range here. So which one would you think is most fair? What are your thoughts? I'll tell you, there isn't really a right answer here, right? I mean, other than I probably wouldn't use charges for all the reasons we talked about a minute ago. So so I would bring it down to, really between. So I would just be like, yeah, I'm not gonna. Even though for this chapter you need to know how to do that. So we're up to you. Which one would you use? Emma. So RVUs because it reflects the complexity of the work. Okay, Caitlin. If they turn around their so Caitlin said, our physicians can control their RVUs. They could turn them around faster. That would bring the RVUs down. So actually, that we would not want our physicians to do that. And the reason we would not want them to do that is because because if they bring their from a billing perspective, if your bills are based on your coding, which they are, they would code at a lower rate. And so ideally what you want, even though there is a time component, you want your physicians to push that limit on the time component. So for example, if a 99215 is 45 minutes to an hour, you'd want your physicians to be hitting that 45 minutes in 1 second rather than 59 minutes and 50 seconds, right? You'd want them to be pushing they want to be. So there's a thing called upcoding, which is when you falsify or you code at a higher level than your visit actually is at. So if you actually did if you said this is a 99215 and you get audited, which they do periodically, or Medicare will come in and do it, or CMS will come in and do an audit of your coding, and they'll be like, you said it was a 99215, which part of the component, part of the evaluation is 45 minutes to an hour, but it appears that you did, so you should only be able to do like 8 of those in a day, and you did 40 of them in a day. So that doesn't seem to jive, right? You're doing too many because it's not physically possible for one human being to do 40 99215s in a day. So clearly what you're doing something here that doesn't add up. So I would say, but you're on the right track in the sense of ultimately what we want is for somehow to, when we use these methods, is to tie, at least in part, effort, right? And that discretionary effort that we talked about. We want to try to use this. This is a system, this is a managerial system, right? That tries to elicit that discretionary effort from your, from people within your, under your management. So you're thinking the right way. But I think the disconnect there would be if you reduced your RVUs, you would wind up with less compensation. So it wouldn't help you. So, so I think I would go with one of these two. You would, to talk about like when we choose these kinds of things, like we talked about with housekeeping, for example, using square footage versus using hours, right? Our square footage is really simple and it's cheap in that sense because you just have it, right? You just measure the space once and you're done. As opposed to hours, you would have to have somebody calculate. So there's a cost benefit measurement there or a cost benefit evaluation there. But in this case, you would already have, all this data. So it's not like you'd have to create new data. So from a cost benefit perspective, there's no real difference. Like you would have the RVUs and you would have the revenues. And so it would just be a matter of which, Taylor's back from lunch and now she's like making the calculation, just like which cell do I choose? And it's not, it's not any more hard for her to do one or the other. And then it really kind of comes down to a judgment call to say, which of these would better, more in my mind, would more accurately reflect the utilization of resources in the organization. My gut would be to go with RVUs, but you could probably make an argument for revenues as well. You'd have to have a little more deep, a little more knowledge on the ground. But my gut would be to go with what Emma said, which was RVUs better reflect complexity. But I think you could make an argument for revenues. But I think RVUs, if we're talking about strictly about cost, I think RVU would be a better measure. Whereas charges, like I like to say, is like monopoly money. It's just something that Taylor made up, before so she could get off to lunch, right? As opposed to, it doesn't necessarily, it has some grounding in reality, but it doesn't have much. All right. So we've done the first two methods, cost to charge and RVU, and I did a kind of a variation on cost to charge where we used revenues. And the point being, really you can pick whatever driver you want. Just make sure that when you choose the driver, right, that you are choosing the organization level driver at whatever level the overhead is. So what I mean is, in this example, the overhead is happening at the ENT level. So whatever driver you have has to be the total at the ENT level, not at one of the services. Right? Then when you do the allocation, that gets you your allocation rate. When you do your allocation amount, that's when you go to the individual service level to get the driver specific to the service. All right. Okay, that's a good place to stop for today. Any questions on what we did so far? Okay. All right, any questions from Zoom land? All right, very good. And I will see you tomorrow for